The escape pod shuddered violently as it punched through the amber atmosphere of the unknown planet. Inside the cramped metallic chamber, 3 very different beings huddled together in darkness, the only illumination coming from emergency indicator lights. All power had been redirected to survival systems, leaving exposed wiring hanging precariously from the ceiling above the 3 differently shaped crash seats arranged in a triangle formation. Crimix gripped the armrests with his upper limbs. His 8 eyes narrowed to slits as he hunched. Spider-inspired form tensed beneath his malted grey-brown exoskeleton. The scorched cylindrical craft gave another violent jolt, and then impact. Short, painful, but thankfully not fatal. Silence descended for a moment before Miser's trembling voice broke it. "A Deathworld?" she whispered, her cyan eyes wide with terror in her violet face. "Of all the places in this galaxy, we had to crash on a Deathworld?" Crimix's nasal openings flared, detecting the sudden change in the air. He turned his head toward Miser, his commissary opening and closing in irritation despite his own fear.
"Would you mind keeping your stinky fear pheromones to yourself?"
he complained.
"I don't know how mammalians survive when your bodies broadcast every feeling by expelling some weird smell."
She was a tall, lithe figure standing just over 6 feet, her deep violet furred skin smooth with a subtle sheen. Her wild, humanoid face was framed by thick strands of gravity-defying brown hair that cascaded down to her waist. Large, almond-shaped cyan eyes dominated her features, their vertical pupils dramatically dilated in the dim light. "It's called being social. Makes all the difference when we have friends and don't die alone in the winter like you insects," she added in a low voice, barely audible. "That is, when you're not an outcast like me." From the 3rd seat, Gothar's translucent azure form rippled as he gathered himself into a more humanoid shape. The 2 drooping antennae atop his dome-shaped head secreted illuminescent fluid that dripped back into his body.
"Both your species are fundamentally flawed,"
he interjected with a superior tone.
"My kind can change the shapes of our bodies and hide from the cold in any crevice. We are self-sufficient, even for reproduction, and—"
"Shut up!" Miser and Crimix said in unison.
"We don't need to hear about the Slimerian's superiority right now,"
Crimix added, his exoskeleton clicking as he shifted in his seat. "We've crashed on a Deathworld," Miser reinforced, her gaze moving between her 2 friends. "A little focus might serve us well." Their bickering was interrupted by sounds emanating from outside. Deep bellowing roars interspersed with high-pitched screeches that sent shivers through all 3 of them. Crimix was the first to recover.
"I think we should take a look outside."
Gothar's form shifted in what appeared to be agreement, and Miser nodded, her cyan eyes still wide. The 3 aliens cautiously approached the bulbous viewport, inching their heads towards it in unison. The world that greeted them was teeming with alien wildlife, frightening wildlife. The dusty amber atmosphere framed a yellow moon visible even in daylight. Dense jungle surrounded them, composed of towering green-black vegetation with thorny protrusions. The ground was covered in thick reddish moss that seemed ominously alive. Winged creatures with multiple eyes circled in the upper canopy. Massive anthropod-like beasts with glowing appendages bulldozed through the underbrush. Swarms of tiny bioluminescent flying creatures periodically vanished into the maws of larger life forms. Crimix took initiative again.
"Miser, check the database. See if there's any information about this world,"
he cursed under his breath.
"Those pirates destroying our ship. Why us out of everyone they could target?"
While Miser moved to the ship's damaged console, Gothar's antenna lowered as he turned to Crimix.
"Are you mentally ill because of this stress?"
he asked with characteristic bluntness. Crimix's commissary clicked rapidly.
I'm fine. You have weird ways of asking things, Gothar.
Before Gothar could respond, Mysa spoke with unexpected excitement. I know where we are! Both aliens turned to her immediately. We're on a Deathworld registered in the Federation, she explained, her fingers dancing over the console. It's a human-owned colony.
Humans?
Crimix's 8 eyes blinked in sequence.
Those mammalian Deathworlders?
Mysa's relatives,
Gothar added, uncharacteristically engaged in the banter. Hardly, Mysa sniffed, her vertical pupils dilating slightly. Humans may be mammalians, but they're the only Deathworld mammalians. I doubt those brutes have anything to do with my peaceful and cooperative kind.
There is nothing peaceful and cooperative about you,
Crimix pointed out. Mysa pouted, the small white dots covering her skin becoming more pronounced around her neck. At least my species' defining trait is caring for our young, unlike your kind who abandon all eggs to their own luck. She switched topics abruptly. I wouldn't be surprised if humans ate their young alive, given how brutal the Federation considers them. For the first time since the crash, all 3 aliens found themselves in agreement. But despite this newfound consensus, they still faced a formidable problem.
The planet is too far for our FTL communication to reach either the Federation or our own species,
Crimix said after verifying their supplies.
And we have no water or food.
Not surprising,
Gothar observed, his form rippling thoughtfully.
This escape pod isn't meant for extended survival. All space is reserved for occupants to quickly flee from dangerous situations and quickly be rescued.
They fell into silence as they contemplated their predicament.
We should contact the humans,
Crimix finally suggested, with Gothar bobbing in agreement. Absolutely not! Mysa's vehemence surprised them both. We're better off going outside. We can try to get food and water while broadcasting a distress signal to space. Eventually, a kind ship will rescue us. After some debate, Mysa's plan won out. They decided to venture outside together, the hydraulic side hatch of the pod hissing open to admit them to their new environment. The air outside was thick with humidity and carried strange scents. They moved cautiously from one peculiar tree to another. The bark seemed to shift colors when touched, with sap that stuck to the skin. The ground squished beneath their feet, releasing clouds of spores with each step, making them increasingly nervous. They made progress slowly, but eventually they got away from the spores and quickly found a river with an unusual green tint. Small floating organisms darted away from their shadows as they approached. Gothar, ever the curious one, extended a pseudopod to touch the water. The moment he did, a giant serpentine creature emerged from the depths. The massive beast had armored scales and multiple rows of protective skin. It reared up, displaying a folding frill of sharp, bony protrusions. The 3 friends froze in place as the creature stared down at them. Together, they saw their end approaching. Then, suddenly, a bipedal being emerged from the woods, a being with hair on its head just like Mysa. Without hesitation, the newcomer positioned himself between them and the serpent. Saying nothing, he threw a dead animal from his back towards the creature, which immediately retreated into the water with its prize. "Human!" Mysa whispered fearfully, her eyes fixed on the bipedal figure. The human simply nodded. "Why didn't you call for help when you crashed here?" he asked. "This planet is dangerous for newcomers." As he stepped closer, his features became clearer. Tall, with weathered skin covered in protective gear made from local materials, eyes alert and constantly scanning, and a weapon slung across his back. The 3 of them exchanged glances, realizing their situation had just become considerably more complicated. For a moment, Crimix and Gothar found themselves temporarily overcoming their fear after the humans' unexpected rescue, and the reason for that was nothing but Mysa herself. They exchanged a quick glance, both noticing something strange about her at the same time. Her eyes were fixed on the human, seemingly enchanted by his presence. Gothar's antennae moved subtly, sensing something unusual in the air with an antenna. Simultaneously, Crimix's nasal openings flared, detecting an unfamiliar scent.
"What pheromones are those?"
Crimix whispered, his voice low enough for only Gothar to hear.
"Fear and something else,"
Gothar responded simply, his gelatinous form rippling with uncertainty. Mysa suddenly turned toward them with a stern gaze that Crimix immediately recognized, a look meant to shut them up. Her violet skin seemed to darken slightly, and Crimix could tell she was deadly serious about their silence. She turned back to the human, her posture tense but her voice steady. "What will you do with us?" Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze remained unwavering. Crimix and Gothar momentarily forgot her mysterious behavior and joined her side, reinforcing her question without saying a word. Crimix's 8 eyes narrowed slightly, his chelicerae partially open in anxiety. The human scratched his head, rough fingers running through short brown hair. His clothing was practical, reinforced synthetic fabric with multiple pockets and tool attachments. A communication device hung from his belt, alongside what appeared to be a smaller weapon than the one on his back. "I saw your ship falling as I was hunting my dinner," he stated matter-of-factly. "I know my species has a bad reputation in the galaxy, but all I plan to do is offer you shelter, food, and communication." Before they could respond, he continued, "I'd love to offer a ship and repairs, but our community here is small. We don't have much and rely on merchants for many resources." The 3 friends exchanged meaningful looks. Crimix realized they were all noticing the same thing about the human. He wasn't acting violent at all. Instead, his speech was well articulated, with traces of proper education. His vocabulary didn't match that of a warrior who knew only violence. Gothar, being the least socially adept among them, shifted his gelatinous form nervously. His antennae drooped slightly before he bluntly asked,
"Is this a trick to capture and eat us?"
Blue ripples of anxiety moved through his transparent body. The human showed his teeth in what Crimix momentarily thought was anger, but the expression created deep creases around his eyes and mouth in a way that seemed non-threatening. "Funny slug. I don't think you would taste good," the human said, his teeth still visible. Turning to Crimix, he added, "Neither would you. I'm not a fan of insects." Crimix's exoskeleton shifted as he involuntarily took a defensive stance. The human then turned to Mysa and began, "As for you," but didn't finish his sentence. Mysa and the human locked gazes in a way that seemed strange to Crimix. Something passed between them that the others couldn't interpret, and the air seemed to thicken with unspoken communication. The human shook his head as if clearing it. "Well, how about going to my place? I'll prepare dinner for everyone. Crash landing in this place must be a terrible experience." His tone shifted to something more gentle and hospitable as he gestured towards a path leading through the thick underbrush, lined with glowing markers. Crimix weighed the decision carefully, ready to ask for Mysa and Gothar's opinion, but before he could speak, Mysa replied for all of them. "We accept." Her voice had an unusual tone, almost eager, that left Crimix speechless. He found the same shocked reaction mirrored in Gothar's rippling form. The journey to the human's home was, for Crimix and Gothar, a blur of weird conversations and unfamiliar terrain. They walked among the maintained path, strange flora shifting away from their movement as if the plants themselves recognized the human's presence. As they walked, the human, who had introduced himself as Edgar, eagerly showed Mysa 3 local creatures they encountered along the way. The first was a 6-legged herbivore with large scales that seemed to change color as it moved through dappled sunlight. It approached Edgar without fear, allowing him to stroke its snout. "This is a shimmerback," Edgar explained as Mysa cowered slightly behind him. "They're harmless. They eat the toxic berries that grow here and convert the poison into these beautiful scales." He guided Mysa's hand to touch the creature. "See? Nothing to fear." The creature made a soft trilling sound before wandering back into the underbrush. Further along the path, Edgar stopped again and crouched low, picking up what looked like a stone. As they watched, the stone unfurled, revealing 6 tiny legs and a set of beady eyes. "Shell rollers," Edgar said, holding the creature in his palm. "They're actually quite intelligent. They collect minerals for their shells that protect them from predators." He offered it to Mysa, who hesitantly accepted it. The small creature seemed to study her before curling back into its protective shell. "They're shy," Edgar explained with a smile, "but incredibly useful. They clear harmful minerals from the water supply." He carefully placed the creature back on the ground, where it promptly rolled away. Most impressive was their encounter with what Edgar called a sky stalker, a massive winged predator that circled overhead, casting a shadow larger than their entire group. When it screeched, Crimix felt his exoskeleton vibrate with the sound. Mysa instinctively pressed closer to Edgar, who merely laughed. "Don't worry, they won't attack us," he said, reaching into a pouch at his belt. He pulled out what looked like a small flute and blew a series of notes. The great beast responded with another screech, but this one sounded different, almost like a greeting. "They're territorial and smart, but they respect boundaries once established. I trade with them. They keep other predators away from my land, and I leave food for them during the harsh season." Crimix watched in amazement as the massive creature dipped one wing in what seemed like acknowledgement before soaring higher into the amber sky. "You see?" Edgar told Mysa, his voice soft but carrying clearly to Crimix's sensitive hearing. "Deathworlds are not that bad. Not the way the Federation makes it seem. It's about understanding and respect." Throughout these encounters, Crimix noticed Mysa's complete attention on Edgar, her cyan eyes rarely leaving his face, her pupils dilating whenever he spoke. It was behavior he'd never witnessed from her before. Crimix and Gothar kept trying to engage Mysa in private conversation as they walked, attempting to understand her reasoning better. She remained vague, merely saying, "Trust me, I have a good feeling about the human," and making strange comments about how females can tell certain things with just a look. Her normally wild hair seemed to move with more animation than usual, and there was a glow to her violet skin that Crimix found puzzling. Of course, Crimix didn't take her word for it. He remained defensive, exchanging cautious glances with Gothar as they passed through increasingly managed territory. The vegetation appeared cultivated, with small automated devices monitoring the environment. Eventually, they reached the doorstep of a wooden house in a clearing, built with local timber that had a curious purple-black hue and stood 2 stories tall. When Edgar opened the door and invited them inside, Crimix and Gothar instinctively took defensive stances around Mysa. They both silently agreed that she wasn't exactly acting like herself. Something was ever so slightly off about her behavior. Her normal bickering with Crimix had completely ceased, for one thing. Edgar noticed their reluctance, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed their protective formation. A look of embarrassment suddenly crossed his features. "I just realized I haven't properly introduced myself," he said, shaking his head. "I'm Edgar, and you 3 are Crimix, Mysa, and Gothar, right? My translator picked up your names earlier." His posture deliberately shifted, shoulders relaxing, hands open at his sides, a universal sign of non-aggression. The trio hesitated for a moment. Crimix felt his doubts and fears subsiding slightly. Edgar's straightforward manner seemed genuine. Before he realized it, he and the others had voluntarily stepped inside the dwelling of the Deathworlder, and the door had already closed behind them with a soft click. The interior was more cozy than threatening. The living area featured handcrafted furniture built to accommodate a human, and the walls were adorned with paintings showing different Federation worlds. Warm lighting created an impressive contrast to the alien wilderness outside.
"This looks better than I thought,"
Crimix told Gothar in a low voice, his mandibles relaxing slightly.
"Perhaps Deathworlders are not that bad,"
Gothar replied, his form settling into a more stable shape. Edgar mentioned he was going to the kitchen to prepare something. "Make yourselves comfortable. I know it's been a rough day for all of you." He paused at the doorway. "Any dietary restrictions beyond the obvious species differences?" They all shook their heads, and the human nodded understanding before disappearing through a doorway. Time passed as they waited in the living room. Crimix's earlier tension had diminished considerably. He ran one of his arms along the surprisingly clean furniture, appreciating the craftsmanship.
"Perhaps that good feeling Miser told us about wasn't wrong,"
he said.
"Maybe we have found our way out of this peril."
Miser looked smug, her violet skin almost glowing with satisfaction. "You both owe me a favor," she declared, her cyan eyes glinting with triumph, a slight smile playing on her lips. Both Crimix and Gothar reluctantly agreed, though Gothar's antennae remained stiff with lingering caution. When Edgar returned, he carried a different plate for each of them. For Crimix, a mixture of fermented plant matter and synthesized proteins arranged in intricate patterns. For Gothar, a bowl of nutrient-rich mineral suspension with electrical stimulation. And for Miser, a colourful assortment of fruits and cooked meat that looked remarkably similar to Edgar's own plate, though hers was arranged with more care. "I did my best with what I know of your species," Edgar explained. "I keep supplies for various visitors to make trades with the merchants easier." The trio, now less distrusting, thanked him and began to eat. Crimix worked his mouth parts delicately to process the perfectly prepared meal, thinking that a being who could easily overpower them wouldn't bother poisoning their food. Gothar absorbed his nutrients gradually, his body changing colours slightly with satisfaction. Miser ate with unusual enthusiasm, occasionally glancing at Edgar. As the meal progressed, Miser's curiosity seemed to grow. Her wildly cascading hair moved with interest as she leaned slightly forward. "What were you doing on this planet before we arrived?" she asked, her cyan eyes fixed intently on Edgar's face. Edgar paused, taking a moment to consider his words. "That's a long story." He dodged her question, then shot back a question of his own. "What were you doing when you crashed here? Why are you travelling with these two?" His tone was casual, but his eyes remained attentive to their reactions. "They're my friends," Miser explained simply, clearly bothered by having her question ignored. "Basically family. Since I was expelled from my clan, I took a job in the Federation administration afterward, and we all decided to take a vacation together before the pirates ruined it." Her hands gestured animatedly as she spoke of their shared past. Crimix and Gothar joined the conversation, each adding pieces of information about their unusual friendship. Crimix described how they met during an interspecies diplomatic conference, while Gothar explained how they started working together on joint projects. They shared stories of overcoming initial prejudices about each other's species, the atmosphere becoming more relaxed, almost friendly. With his food half consumed, Crimix finally asked the question that had been bothering him since their first encounter with Edgar.
"Why does your species have such a bad reputation? And why are you so different from what we expected?"
His 8 eyes focused intently on the human, watching for any signs of deception or discomfort. Edgar's expression became more serious as he considered his answer, the warm lighting of the room casting shadows across his weathered features. Edgar leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced before him as he considered Crimix's question about humanity's reputation. The wooden furniture creaked slightly under his weight, the sound amplified in the momentary silence. "Humanity joined the Federation during a time of war," he finally explained, his voice measured and calm. "The way we fought, it scared the other species." His expression became earnest, eyes focused on conveying sincerity. "We're doing our best to correct this impression. We've already made a few allies among Federation species." He pointed specifically at Miser and added, "Not to a species similar to us, though." His gesture was casual, but his eyes lingered on Miser's face. The lighting in the room had shifted as night fell outside, casting long shadows across the floor as if waiting for her reply. Crimmix noticed Mysa seemed to understand something from the exchange that completely eluded him. Her cyan eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned forward with a new intensity. "You haven't replied to my question yet," she pointed out. "What are you doing in this world?" Her posture shifted, leaning slightly toward Edgar. Her wild silver-white hair seemed to move with great animation, and her cyan eyes reflected the room's ambient lighting with unusual intensity. Crimmix had never seen her this focused on another being before. Edgar scratched his head, fingers running through his short brown hair. "Unforgiving, aren't you?" he said with a playful tone, his smile creating creases around his eyes. "Long story short, my wife left me, and I wanted a change. It was supposed to be just a year on this planet, then just one more year, and before I realized it, 5 years had passed." His expression shifted between wistful and amused as he spoke, gesturing to the room around them, indicating the life he'd built there. "Sometimes a new beginning is exactly what you need." Mysa laughed, a sound Crimmix recognized as irony. "Hard to believe you'd be on this world just because of an incompatible mate," she said, her voice carrying a note of challenge. "What did your mate do to scare you that much?" Her posture became more animated, the cyan in her eyes intensifying, pupils dilating slightly. Her fingers tapped continuously on the table's surface, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the tension building in the room. Edgar's tone changed abruptly, becoming harder. The muscles in his jaw visibly tightened, and his previously relaxed posture became rigid. "Hey, I didn't ask why they expelled you from your clan," he said sharply. "You shouldn't ask certain things so soon." The room temperature seemed to drop slightly with the sudden shift in atmosphere. This unexpected change scared Crimmix and Gothar. Crimmix's exoskeleton clicked rapidly in anxiety, while Gothar's form moved defensively, his antennae flattening against his head. What was most surprising to Crimmix, however, was Mysa's reaction. She didn't seem affected by the human's tone at all. In fact, she was smiling, as if this reaction was exactly what she had expected, or perhaps even wanted. "What do you humans consider normal questions, then?" she asked, her tone slightly provocative. Her eyes remained fixed on Edgar's face without a trace of fear. To Crimmix's further surprise, Edgar returned to his normal demeanor remarkably quickly, his shoulders relaxed, face softening as he began explaining a bit about humanity. Weirdly, he brought up something called dating, a concept Crimmix couldn't associate with their current situation. "Humans typically get to know each other gradually," Edgar explained, his hands becoming animated as he spoke. "We share small details first, favorite foods, daily activities, interests, the deeper stuff, past relationships, family conflicts, personal failures, those come later." The tension in the room dissipated gradually as Edgar continued. "It's a bit like approaching one of the creatures outside. You don't make sudden movements or try to touch sensitive areas right away. You establish boundaries, show respect, then slowly build familiarity." Gothar touched Crimmix's arm with a gelatinous appendage, leaving a slight cool sensation on his exoskeleton.
"Do you know why Mysa and the human have forgotten us?"
he whispered close to Crimmix's auditory openings. Only then did Crimmix fully notice what Gothar had already perceived. There was a weird back and forth happening between Mysa and Edgar that was difficult to follow. Crimmix found himself completely weirded out by the exchange, realizing there were at least 2 additional layers in their communication beyond the words being spoken. The meaningful gazes and the new pheromones filling the air. His 8 eyes darted between the two, trying to decode their interaction. It was even more complex than initially apparent, with innuendos and verbal curveballs thrown by either side. It was as if they were engaged in some sort of verbal war that operated by rules Crimmix couldn't begin to comprehend. His kind just mated once a year, laid eggs, and that was it. Nothing like the weird verbal battle he was hearing. Edgar's body language shifted between open and guarded, while Mysa's responses came with subtle changes in her voice that carried meanings beyond her words. Whatever Crimmix was watching was definitely a side of their friend they had never seen before. Hours passed as Crimmix and Gothar felt increasingly invisible. The windows showed the alien night falling completely, stars twinkling in the amber sky. Their fear increased every time Mysa said something bordering on what they considered disrespect, only for normalcy to return minutes later. The pattern repeated in an exhausting cycle, with food and drinks occasionally refreshed but barely acknowledged. Humans value independence, Edgar was saying at one point, but we also form deep bonds. We're contradictory that way. Sounds efficient, Mysa replied, leaning closer. Why not simply establish clear hierarchies and roles like most species? Because we can change, Edgar countered, mirroring her posture. Rigid systems break under pressure. Flexibility means survival. Mysa's eyes glinted. Is that what happened with your mate? She changed and didn't want you anymore? The cycle continued, with moments of tension followed by unexpected returns to normalcy, leaving Crimmix and Gothar increasingly confused. It all culminated when Mysa said directly that Edgar's previous mate was unworthy. Her voice carried a surprising edge of conviction, as if she had somehow gained the authority to make such a judgment. Edgar rose from his chair abruptly. The sudden movement caused the furniture to scrape loudly against the floor. He stared at her for a moment, his expression complex and reluctant, a painful expression passing through the air that made Crimmix and Gothar freeze in place. Then, without warning, Edgar rushed to his room, declaring that there was nothing more to discuss with Mysa and her weird friends, and that he didn't want to see them in his home come morning. The door slammed shut with an ominous click. Crimmix nearly fainted in fear, his exoskeleton vibrating with anxiety, while Gothar's form collapsed slightly, losing cohesion momentarily. After the initial fear came anger, not at the human, who had been a respectful host until provoked, but at their friend, who had caused this unfortunate situation.
I don't understand. What are you doing?
Crimmix said to Mysa, his voice rising with each word. His mandibles clicked rapidly in agitation.
Are you trying to get us killed?
Gothar's form rippled in obvious disapproval.
Your behavior is incomprehensible and dangerous,
he added, his antennae dropping in distress. Mysa stared at the door where the human vanished for what felt like an eternity. A strange expression crossed her face, something between amusement and resignation. Her wild hair seemed to settle slightly as she sighed, the sound unexpectedly heavy. She placed a hand over both their shoulders, the touch gentle but firm. I love both of you like family, but there are things you will never understand about me, just like I won't understand about you. She turned to Gothar. You are a self-sufficient being who can clone yourself at will. Her eyes moved to Crimmix. And your species has no romantic bonds between individuals. Her voice carried a mixture of affection and sadness that caught Crimmix off guard. Still, he wasn't ready to let it go. He put her hand aside firmly, his exoskeleton clicking with frustration.
That is not an explanation,
he demanded.
We deserve to know why you've been behaving so strangely.
Gothar nodded in agreement, his form solidifying slightly with determination. There were things I thought I had lost forever when I was expelled from my clan, Mysa finally explained, her voice softer now. Tonight, I remembered those feelings and got carried away. I became too aggressive. Her expression showed genuine remorse, mixed with something else, a longing that Crimmix couldn't fully comprehend. Her hands gestured expressively, emphasizing her words.
You became a different person,
Gothar observed, his voice carrying unusual emotion for a Slimerian.
What are we going to do now that the human hates us? We still need his help to contact the Federation.
I can fix this easily, Mysa replied with unwavering confidence. She reassured them that she would apologize, her certainty seeming strangely unshakable. A subtle smile played at the corners of her mouth, and her gaze held a knowing quality that further confused Crimmix.
The human will never accept your apology,
Crimmix pointed out, his 8 eyes narrowing with doubt. Mysa only laughed, a sound that held secrets Crimmix couldn't decipher. "That's impossible," she said with absolute conviction. "I've learned enough about him to be sure." Crimmix started to ask how she could possibly know that, but was cut off when Mysa simply turned away, saying, "Watch me," in a low voice. She walked toward Edgar's room with purposeful strides, her shoulders set with determination. She knocked on the door with a distinctive pattern, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent house. Crimmix noticed a hint of worry cross her face as time passed without response. When she knocked a second time, the door opened slightly, Edgar barely visible in the gap. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice softer than Crimmix had ever heard it. The human hesitated for a second, but then nodded. "Yes," he said simply, opening the door wider. She disappeared inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the stunned silence she left behind. Crimmix and Gothar tensed immediately, their anxiety only worsening as time passed. Only discernible words leaked from the room, sometimes voices rising slightly before falling again, occasional laughter breaking the tension momentarily. The sounds were muffled and impossible to interpret clearly. Crimmix and Gothar eventually found a couch to sit on, the unfamiliar furniture creaking slightly under their weight.
"Do you think he's going to eat her alive?"
Gothar finally asked, his voice quivering slightly, antennae drooping. Luminescent fluid pooled beneath him on the couch, betraying his extreme distress. Crimmix didn't know how to reply. The wild side of their friend was something they had never witnessed before. Still, he offered his opinion, uncertain but thoughtful.
"I don't think so,"
he said slowly.
"But there is something obvious that we are missing. That much I can tell."
The night stretched in moments of fitful rest and worry. Strange dreams plagued Crimmix's brief periods of sleep, visions of Mysa transforming into something unrecognizable, of Edgar revealing monstrous features, of the Deathworld creatures swallowing them all. Crimmix's awareness returned abruptly the next morning when he heard the sound of a door opening. He saw Mysa and Edgar leave the room together, emerging side by side, walking in synchronized steps. A weird closeness seemed to have developed between them overnight. Mysa's normally wild hair appeared unusually settled, and Edgar's expression was relaxed, almost serene. Mysa looked happy, though Crimmix noticed a certain reluctance in her gaze whenever she looked directly at Edgar, as if she couldn't bear to hold his gaze for too long. She would glance at him, then away, then back again in a strange rhythm. Edgar took his time adjusting a chair for her at the table, an unexpected courtesy that surprised Crimmix. Even more surprising was when the human gently pet Mysa's head, while promising he would handle breakfast for her friends. The gesture was shockingly intimate, and Mysa's reaction showed a mixture of embarrassment and satisfaction that Crimmix had never seen on her before. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting everything in a golden glow that seemed to transform the interior of the house. Edgar left Mysa at the table and approached Crimmix and Gothar with a wide smile on her face, as if the heated dinner conversation had never happened. "Good morning," he said warmly. "Please, join us for breakfast. I hope you slept well despite the circumstances." His demeanor was genuinely hospitable, without a trace of the previous night's tension. Crimmix and Gothar exchanged confused glances but followed him to the table. As they settled into their seats, Edgar broke the silence again. "After breakfast, I'll contact the Federation," he said, surprising them both. "You have nothing to worry about anymore. Rescue will be here soon." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation, waiting, and confusion. Edgar was true to his word, using his communications equipment to contact a Federation vessel that happened to be passing through a nearby system. Arrangements were made quickly, their position on their planet transmitted. During those 2 days, Crimmix and Gothar observed the strange new dynamic between Mysa and Edgar with fascination and confusion. They seemed to orbit each other, always aware of the other's position in a room, exchanging glances laden with meaning. Sometimes they would disappear for hours, returning later with no explanation. When the Federation rescue ship finally arrived, Crimmix and Gothar found themselves standing at the boarding ramp while Mysa remained behind. "I'm staying," she told them simply. "Just for the rest of my vacation."
"But,"
Crimmix began, only to be cut off by her raised hand. "I'll be fine," she assured them, her cyan eyes bright with an emotion Crimmix couldn't name. "I'll catch up with you both when I return." And so it was that Crimmix and Gothar found themselves watching from a Federation rescue ship as they ascended, the wooden home growing smaller on the planet below. Mysa waved at them from Edgar's side, the two figures standing close together on the clearing before the house. Both figures became indistinct as distance increased, eventually disappearing when the Federation ship reached the clouds. The viewport showed the transition from atmosphere to space, stars becoming visible as they left the planet behind. Crimmix turned to Gothar, his exoskeleton shifting with uncertainty.
"Do you have any idea what happened down there?"
he asked, with genuine confusion in his voice.
"Why did Mysa decide to stay in this Deathworld for the rest of her vacation?"
Gothar's form shifted uncertainty, his antennae drooping slightly.
The only thing I can think of is that perhaps all of that was some convoluted mammalian ritual of forgiveness for her disrespect the first night.
Crimmix considered this for a moment, then slowly shook his head.
"I don't think that was the case,"
he said thoughtfully.
"I believe mammalians have a skill to tame Deathworlder creatures. Edgar tamed the wildlife around him."
He paused, the realization dawning on him.
"And Mysa tamed Edgar himself."
His limbs shifted into a more relaxed configuration as understanding finally began to emerge. The ship's engines vibrated softly in the background as silence stretched between them. They had reached space, the Deathworld now just a point of light among countless others.
That sounds plausible,
Gothar finally said, his voice carrying a note of wonder.
But why would she want to tame a human?
Crimmix's 8 eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture of contemplation among his kind.
"Perhaps that is how she overcame her fear of this Deathworld,"
he suggested.
"Tame the beast tamer, and the world is yours. Isn't that right?"
Gothar just nodded, leaving the question for Mysa to answer herself the next time they saw her.